Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stedman podcast. Today, we are going to actually be talking about a topic that you, our listening audience, has requested, and we're going to kind of reveal that in a little bit. But before we do that, I would like to welcome our co-host Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing today?
Glad the Super Bowl's over. Um, I'm kind of as a Steelers fan, I think I would rather your Cleveland Browns win the Super Bowl than the Chiefs again. So, um,
I felt like the Super Bowl this year was probably the most exciting.
okay,
I mean, just because it was close. The only thing I had an issue with is I felt the halftime show, even though I like Usher and I thought he did a good job, I just felt like compared to other halftime shows in the past, this was very underwhelming as far as the spectacle, I guess you would say. You know what I
yeah.
mean? It was
Well,
like
yeah, I don't know. I I, I was just tired of it, but like it had nothing to do with the teams in it. It had nothing to do with the halftime show, but like I don't know, like I think it was last year that they added an extra week onto the football season, the NFL season, so they play one more game than what they normally do. I think before it was 16 weeks and now it's 17 or something
17,
like
yeah.
that. I don't remember. But like it just seems like this season took forever. And I don't know if it's because it was later in February that they're playing the Super Bowl. I mean, it's like the second week, but like sometimes the Super Bowl's in January, sometimes the Super Bowl's in February. Um, and college football wrapped up, and I don't know, man. Like I just got tired of. I think I'm tired of it and ready for warmer weather and I don't know, baseball. I don't something different. So
Yeah. All right. Yes. Good. So as we dive into before we dive into our topic, stories gone wild. Um any wild stories that you have to share with us, Micah?
yeah, it actually involves you.
Oh no. What did I
Plot
do?
plot twist.
Oh, did I forget
So
to respond to one of your text messages? That's usually kind of what the story's gone wild is.
Uh, no, for the listeners, he does forget. Like, I just wonder. I seldomly wonder if Scott just keeled over because it'll be days
So
until I
yeah,
hear from him.
and it also depends on the week. Like last week was a busy week. I was barely
Yeah,
in my office last week, so I was probably bad at responding to anything. If you, even like you called me and left a message, I probably would have heard the message. Go, oh, I need to call you back, and never did.
I don't know if that's just something that comes with age, but like, the older you get, like I remember being in my 20s and I was like, man, I was texting people all day long and I would have like 30 text messages and I'd be really good at responding. And now I like leave my text messages unread for days and I'm like, oh, I need to text my brother back. Or,
Well,
oh, I need to go ahead.
it could be, but I mean, I've actually this week I texted a buddy of mine who, we grew up in the same church, and he's usually notorious for not getting back to me. And then he'll always text me like, "Oh, I'll get back to you. I'm so sorry for I'm being such a bad friend right now." I'm like, "It's okay, I understand," because he's busy, he's a pastor, and so but he's also older too. But then I have another guy I check in monthly, and he's younger than I am, and same thing. Very rare that he responds back to my text messages or return my calls. So I think it may not have to do necessarily with age. I think it just has to do with just not only being busy with the church, but even like with the younger pastor that I'm in contact with. He has a young daughter, so it's kind of like I'm doing ministry work. My wife works. I'm also kind of taking care of my child. So, and I get that. I understand that very well.
Yeah. So my story, um, we, you and I, it's not like we like scour the internet for topics to talk about, but like you had mentioned that the Church of God was having a town hall with Jim Lyon last week.
Yeah.
And you asked me if I was going to watch it. And, just figured that like, hey, we would just both watch it and then we kind of review it and then talk about it and so like last week you had texted me. That was like one of the before you texted me yesterday to tell me what we're going to talk about today. But you texted me early last week and was like, "Hey, are you going to watch the town hall?" And I'm like, "Sure." When it like Thursday, and I was like, "All right." So it got to be Thursday, and I'm on Facebook and I'm on the Church of God site, and it's like town hall Thursday. And I'm like, why is this not working? Like, there's nobody there. There's no live stream. I looked on their YouTube page, I looked on their website, and I'm like, I texted Scott, and I'm like, Scott, you goof, it's the following Thursday. And I felt like an idiot because I'm sitting there like, where's Jim Lyon? Where is this town hall on Facebook Live? And apparently Scott and I can't read
Well, the
graphics
problem is
because
I kept getting popped up, and I think sometimes it's not necessarily the graphic; it's sometimes maybe even just the blurb, where it's like you don't want to miss the town hall on Thursday, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it's this Thursday, and it's like, well, no, it's not, and I don't know. And again, I that was my son's field trip, so I was a chaperone, so it's like I can't watch it; I have to like chaperone kids, so it
well,
was.
it was just funny because I was like, where's the live stream? And so then I finally like clicked on the graphic and it said February the 14th, which is this Thursday.
Hmm,
So anyway, that was my stories gone wild. Not trying to throw you under the bus, my friend. I just
no,
thought it was funny that
so
you
the
you said
story's
that.
got so you know how like if you're I don't know. I've only and I don't want to be I don't want to say stereotypes, but I know that the few times I have spoken at like a predominantly African American church, when I preach, I'm always getting responses back, like the amens or oh man, you're preaching now. Ooh, like I'm getting like those feedback. It's like, oh man, the few times I preached at an African American church, I loved it. So anyway, Tuesday, there is a pastors gathering at the Grove City United Methodist Church, and my pastor signed me up, and also our outreach minister to go to this event. So I went there, and you know what? It was kind of reminded me of GA without all the business meetings. It was basically a simple time of worship and connection, and just kind of doing whatever. So this is all the West Ohio Conference. So we're sitting there, and we had a speaker who was talking about some of the trends that you've seen with like Gen Z and the church and everything else, and kind of this idea of, the idea of we don't have to be innovators because God's the innovator, but we kind of have to be open to how God is innovating to be able to connect with people who really don't see church as a priority anymore. So it was really good topic. And this person was like a professor at Princeton. So it was pretty cool. But I remember, but the one thing is they had some people kind of speak or share at their table. And there's this older pastor that walks up there, and he's talking about how he's a boomer.
Oh
It's like,
goodness.
okay. So immediately I'm thinking, oh no, what's this going to be about? And then this dude is like, the problem is I'm a boomer, but I don't even know how to talk to my own people. I don't know how to talk to these other boomers that they need to get their act together because they are killing the next generation with all their, they say that the young people are the future of the church, but then they want to talk about how much money they've invested in a church and how they don't want to be able to do anything or share space or do whatever. And I'm thinking, and I'm like verbally going, ooh, like this guy was like doing like uppercuts and right hooks to the boomer generation as a boomer, and I was enjoying the show. It was fantastic. I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, dude, that's my new best friend. Like, and then again, I mean, for those of you who are boomers who listen, like, I'm not saying all boomers are like that, but there has been a what you would call like almost a stereotype of church boomers who say, oh, we need young people in the church. Young people are the future of the church. We want all this stuff. But then they say that, but then their actions always kind of do the opposite of engaging with younger families or younger people to become participants in church life.
I mean, I've got so much that I could say about that, but like I'm not going to. It's just something that I've realized over the last couple of years, especially. Like there's so much judgment from that generation, and it's like you wonder why people aren't coming to church. You wonder why people don't feel welcome. You wonder why there's this sense of, you know, territorialness, I guess if that's a word, people marking their territory. Um, it's just it's really sad, is what it is. And it's great example of this, and I'm not, you know, belittling or judging or anything, but last night, um, our contractor was here wrapping up the project at our house, and I kind of was watching the Super Bowl, and I kind of wasn't, and I was just trying to run around getting stuff cleaned up after he had left. Um, and so the halftime show was on, and I didn't really watch much of it, but like that was me growing up in high school. That was my, you know, era of music, and like so
Mhm.
Usher was super popular when I was in
Oh
high school,
yeah.
right? But like, and I'm sure we'll get into this with our topic, uh, but like, um I'm scrolling through Facebook and I see a lot of these older folks that are, you know, friends of mine, pastors, uh, older folks that I know or acquaintances with my grandparents or my parents. Like they're like turning the Super Bowl off and like taking pictures of it on their Facebook, like pictures of like their TV being turned off because they thought it was ridiculous that Usher would be on TV and that he was dancing the way that he was and singing the songs the way he was. And it was like, you know, it's not like a Christian genre of music, but like he wasn't hurting nothing,
Yeah.
right? Like
I felt like
part of the
Usher was
Super Bowl,
probably
it's a
the
party.
tamest. I feel like Usher was probably more tamed than like Rihanna last year.
Or, you know,
I
Janet Jackson.
or Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake. I mean, yeah, let's or even like, and even Lady Gaga when she did, I thought she did a great job, but I didn't think it was that outrageous. But even I felt like Usher was tamed to that, and I didn't think Lady Gaga had you know, a very overtly sexual or conflicting message that she was singing in her songs. So it is. It's one of the
And that's just
yeah.
one example of like this whole
Yeah.
judgment thing. And it's like, you know, another one, you know, we talked about 2024 being an election year a couple weeks ago, in politics in the church, but it's like, believe it or not, Scott, there are people that believe things that are different than we do.
Yeah.
Christians, not Christians, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, gay, straight, black, white, like people are different. Like, and the fact of the matter is, whether we agree with it or not, we're all different, but we're all children of God. Like, we just, I think that generation, do you consider our parents boomers or is it our grandparents?
So I one time made the mistake of calling my dad a boomer one time, and he's like, "I'm not a boomer." Well, technically he is, but it's interesting because it's almost like when people say I'm a millennial, and I go, "No, I'm not." But
Yeah.
because technically I'm an elder millennial, but the way people describe millennials, someone who was born in like 1982 may have a different lookout than someone who's born in 1990.
What I was
If
getting at,
because
like,
again, because well, 9/11. I mean, if you look at 9/11 kind of being that, kind of like that,
gap bridge.
or almost like that traumatic event in the millennial generation and even Gen Z as well. I was already graduated high school when that happened.
Yeah.
Someone who was born in like the 90s, they're probably like in middle school right now when that happened. So the way you are and your developmental and a big tragedy, a national tragedy like that happens, it's going to affect you differently. So sometimes it's like, there's certain things where I kind of identify more with Gen X than I do with millennials, but then there's other things that I do, like the technology side. Like, yeah, like I picked up technology real quick. I had all those technology. So if that makes me a millennial, then I'm a millennial. But as
I'm
far as
just,
like
I think
my
I'm
personality,
speaking
yeah.
I
So
think
go
I'm
ahead.
speaking like our parents and our
Mm-hmm.
grandparents, like like collectively, as I'm talking about some of this judgment and some of this um I don't want to call it rhetoric, but like this idea or I set of ideas that like if you're not agreeing with the way that we do things or the way that we say things or the way that we believe things, in respect to politics or the way the church should be, then we're just going to write you off and turn you off. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like, well, that's not like Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm like, I'm extremely grateful for things like social media and Zoom and the ability to podcast and have these conversations like we do every week. But like, we send each other videos all the time, and some of them are funny, and some of them are like outlandish as far as people in churches and the way they do things, and like like I would never do those things. And I'm not saying, hey, I'm not being an advocate for that, but
Yeah.
there are some videos that we send each other where people have valid points. Like we talked about giving in last week's episode, we talked about tithing. I sent you a video this morning about a guy who is a theologian and a scholar, and he talks about how he gave to a church for 20 years. And then he felt like the Lord was releasing him from that because he said it wasn't biblical. It wasn't biblically accurate to tithe. And he felt like it was a scam
Mm.
because it's just to improve the church and to pay salaries of people and to, you know, make a church go into debt. And it's just like this vicious cycle. Um, there are several instances where, I'm seeing these videos where there's this trauma that comes from churches and then they wonder why, but then there's this judgment and this automatic writing off of other generations or future generations beyond the boomers and the people that are our parents. And then they wonder why their churches are empty on Sundays and they wonder why they can't grow. And before you and I hit record, you're talking about your church, going through some sort of consulting process, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is great because you guys honestly want to assess where you are, what you can do better, and how you're going to get better to grow, to see things in a different lens. But, when we had Jeanette on a couple weeks ago, she talked about recommendations, right? Like people can come in, and I think it's great when people come in, like consulting companies and whatnot. And it's like they see what we don't see because we're going, you and I are pastoring and we're like in the churches, in the trenches every single week. Whereas a consultant comes in and they've never been there before and they're seeing it with fresh eyes. My wife likes to say fresh eyes, and um, they can offer insight and recommendations based on what they're seeing. And so, like, I think it's great when churches go through that. But like, if you've got generations that are automatically going to write that off, then why waste the time to do it? Because the church has already made up its mind. Sorry, rant over.
No.
I went
Yeah.
on a huge rant because I just feel compelled to share that because it's like why just tell me, Scott, why is it the way it is?
I don't know. And see, it's interesting because if I think about like my parents, like I think my parents would fit in that boomer category, or kind of like the tail end of the boomers. They're kind of like the baby. I guess if you have elder boomers, then you kind of have like your young boomers. They would be kind of at the tail end of that group. And there's times where my dad can say some things or make some comments, and I'm like, eh. But there's also times where if I kind of speak up and say, hey, it's not always like that. I think you're getting wrong information. And let me tell you what I've learned and kind of the things that I've heard from, people I've talked to and some of the things I've read. And when I have those conversations, he is to the point where he will listen. He's not like, oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, he's very good, and we talk about things, and we kind of, even sometimes there may be certain approaches that we may disagree with, but we do agree with kind of each other's point of view and kind of where we're coming from and kind of understand the other person's point of view. And especially, and I think the big thing, like if me and my dad ever get into a conflict with politics, usually it always ends up with my dad kind of being more of, well, if we look at it from a policy perspective, this isn't bad. This actually does good, and I can see how it does good for not only his company, like if it's something that's like a business thing, how well this is good for his company and how he can use these breaks to kind of help filter that down to those who are working at his company, the blue collar workers, and how they can get more and how they can benefit more from this, right? But then I can also go back and say, well, okay, I understand the policy. I could see how you approach business is different than how an Elon Musk will approach business. You definitely might do that. Someone else may not. They may say, oh, here's this incentive. Now I'm going to get richer. I'm now making $1 million. I'm now making $5 million. Or, you may like this president because he has great policies, and that's fine. I agree with that. But at the same time, I have very questions about this person's character.
Yeah.
Even though they have great policies, are they going to live it out, or are they just telling what the audience wants to hear to get votes?
Yeah.
And I become very skeptical of sometimes that, because if I'm seeing someone's character, then it doesn't matter what they say. I'm going to have like a very cynical eye and going, okay, well, this isn't going to fly. But yeah, so again, that's kind of my story's gone wild. I just thought it was interesting that someone from that generation was saying, hey, my generation, you need to wise up here, because you don't realize it, but we're really kind of the main people on why our churches are so small, because we've screwed up,
Hijacked your story's gone wild.
I know. So now let's get to now today we're going to get to our main topic. And actually, this was actually given to us through an email. And basically they said that, a good topic would be for, would be to see how, if pastors should be doing counseling or therapy within their churches. They said that may make a good podcast episode, and I agree, because someone who got their master's of divinity in pastoral counseling, this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I'm also not passionate about seeing people healed and doing good counseling within the church, but also knowing my limitations and also seeing how it has been abused. And actually, not only was this suggested, but they kind of share a story how this person was connected to a church through a counseling program and was seeing the senior pastor regularly for counseling, was attending church, and kind of had a relationship not only with the pastor, but also with the pastor's daughters, who kind of referred to this woman as, a sister. I mean, at this time she was young. And she tells the story about how, looking back, she kind of saw how he kind of exploded some of her vulnerabilities in the counseling room, was kind of doing like a deep attachment or grooming with her. And then during a Sunday school class or some type of class, she was there, and the pastor said they had a brief conversation with a couple at a church who knew of somebody that, might be interested in, going on a date with her, because she was single. And the pastor made the comment, if I wasn't married, I would date you. Which she talks about how she was shocked, felt very disoriented. And then eventually he went back to his office, and then he came back and asked her to come back to his office, and basically had a brief conversation with her and said, hey, you shouldn't tell anybody that I said that to you, and then kind of closed out that meeting in prayer. And kind of felt like that this pastor had like deep control of this woman emotionally in his office as she was seeing him for counseling. Actually got to the point that he after he left that church, he actually pastored 3 more churches before the credentialing, before somebody sent an official complaint to the Church of God. And again, this is happening in the Church of God church, and basically was told that he needed to surrender his credentials or they were going to take them from him. And eventually he did. So, he pastored 3 more years, kind of doing the same thing, doing some of this things. And luckily, only gave a snapshot, but that's kind of where they kind of ended, like, and kind of the way this person closed out this email says, I hope the Church of God continues to improve with education, prevention, and proper care of survivors. I want all children well protected from any type of predator, of course, as well. I wish more churches as places like Grace, which is like netgrace.org, to evaluate their church environment. And I checked out the website. It's actually an organization that not only can like an independent organization that can kind of look at church culture to see if it's a toxic culture, especially that kind of opens response to abuse or trauma, and kind of, or even have like different like services that you can get online training to how to make your churches more safe from this type of predatorial behavior. So I thought, again, I got that email and I was just shocked by, I think it's shocked when someone tells about their experience and you're just like, oh, that's horrible. I'm so sorry that happened to you. But, when we think about things like the Southern Baptists and some of these other churches and denominations, that, this is something that kind of happens. And sometimes local churches and even sometimes the national churches are not very good at addressing it or kind of confronting it head on, or even addressing that they do have an issue. So thanks to our listener who sent that to us, and thank you for the topic. And we're going to discuss that. So Micah, should pastors be counselors to their congregation?
I think yes and no.
Okay.
Um, and you said your master's was in,
Pastoral counseling.
but it was divinity?
Divinity, yeah.
Okay. Did you have any sort of licensure that went along with your counseling?
So here's how. So when I went to, so I got my MDiv at Ashland Seminary.
Okay.
And they changed it. They changed the program, but originally the program they had was a 2-year cohort, and you had your pastoral counselors and your clinical counselors all together in the same room. So as I'm sitting here, I am learning things about how to do a diagnosis, how to read psychological testing, and even give psychological testing. I mean, so I'm learning a lot of clinical things. However, because I was a pastoral counselor by the state of Ohio, I'm not allowed to do a diagnosis. I'm not allowed to do psychological testing. I'm not allowed to write prescriptions for psychotic medication, and I'm not allowed to charge money for my services. Only people who are licensed clinical counselors can do all those things. I cannot. So a lot of times when I was doing counseling, or people wanted to see me for counseling, whether it was someone off the streets or if it was a parishioner, I'd let them know ahead of time. I'm a public servant, which means that if you say anything that can cause harm to anybody else or yourself, I have to report it to the authorities. I also told them that I am not a licensed clinical counselor. I am a pastoral counselor, which means I will listen to you. I will counsel you. However, if there is something that I believe is outside of my realm or expertise, or if I think you need a lot more help than what I'm able to give, I am going to refer you out. I do not take payment. And I will not diagnose you. Like I may listen to you, and I may, in my head, I may do a diagnosis just to kind of help me understand, like, okay, just based on what I've learned and kind of the self-diagnosis I just kind of did of you for my own personal thing, it does seem like you may possibly have this type of disorder, which means I'm going to have to refer you out.
Yeah.
Or I would refer you out to seek for the counseling side, but then if you still want spiritual counseling, I'm still available and I will just work on the spiritual.
Yeah. I guess that was my first question. Because a lot of times, like you said, you have to, there's a lot of parameters around counseling, right? Like if there's any sort of like self-harm or harm to others, you have to report it to the police. Like we have to do that in higher ed. Like if there's any sort of like, self-harm or otherwise, like we have to report that to the police and to the university. And, there's this whole thing. The reason I asked about licensure is that like, so I have been open about therapy. I've been in therapy for almost 2 years, but my counselor, my therapist is licensed. I pay
Yeah.
her. I see her once a month. There's a set rate. There's a set time.
Hmm.
Um, and whatever I tell her stays with us, right? And like, we unpack whatever's going on in my life at the time. And um, I think it's a great exercise. Um, I I would be hesitant to counsel those of the church that I pastor because of the situation that you just presented.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is that, like, let's just say that you're counseling folks within your congregation, you know, it's really hard to be subjective when that person walks through the door and you are the pastor and you're getting ready to get up and preach the word of God and share, and that person walks into the room and you're like, well, that person's having an affair right now, or that person's hooked on drugs, or that it's like it's really hard for you to be subjective in the moment. And I mean that like in purely in respect to the conversation of like, I'm not saying, hey, you're gonna call that person out like this person did in the email that you read, Scott, but like, how are you supposed to stay subjective in your own heart and mind, knowing that that stuff's going on in the back of your mind while you're supposed to be able, supposed to be preaching and teaching and leading um, a church. And I just think that would be incredibly difficult. Now, if it were, somebody in the community, if that was somebody from another church, like if you have a friend who's a pastor of another church and they referred folks to you, they can come to you and like there's no attachment there. And this is like purely Scott, I know that you've counseled people within your churches that you've pastored. But that's purely from my experience. Like I don't know that I could in clear conscience uh have those conversations and lead a church effectively.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of baggage that goes along with that.
Hmm. Yeah. So you bring up very good points because I mean, and I would even say, I think it's difficult for both, whether it's a person inside the church and outside the church. And here's why. Because again, I agree with you 100%. Like when you're counseling someone who is a part of your congregation, and let's say you know that they have issues or whatever that issue or that vice may be. And so you're up there preaching, and sometimes you have to go like, okay, on one thing, you want to make sure that when you're preaching, that it's being guided by God and by how the Holy Spirit's leading you. At the same time, you almost kind of almost double check yourself in some ways. Because let's say if I'm going to be preaching on, you know, if I'm going to be preaching on like the dangers of drug addictions or just addictions in general, right? And I know that I'm seeing somebody in the congregation for a counseling session that has an addiction. Okay, well, even if I don't use like a illustration, or even if I use that person's story and just change the names or do whatever, that person's probably going to feel hurt or going to feel attacked. Even if I don't use an illustration, if I just even speak on the topic in general, that person may think, oh, he's only doing that sermon because he knows about my addiction. So there's almost kind of like this thing where you go, okay, there's an issue, there's a problem, right? Um, the thing with the having outside people coming in to seek counseling is eventually they build a relationship with their counselor, which is kind of the whole counselor client, relationship and privilege. And when that happens, sometimes that person may want to be a member of your church. And then, of course, oh, how are you? And then, when you have church people asking, oh, how do you know what brings you here? It's like, oh, because I've been seeing Pastor Scott for counseling for 5 years. Then it's like, oh, okay. And then people are going, oh, well, then why are they seeing counseling? Like, what's going on? Because again, even though we're in the year 2024, mental health is still kind of a taboo topic, which it shouldn't be. But there's still people who don't get help for a variety of reasons. because they are afraid of whatever judgment, or it shows weakness, or whatever that may be. So, and I mean, there's a couple times when I've counseled people in the community. Um, there's a couple things where you go, oh, like, where, you have to also kind of be careful with that as well, because especially if they're seeing you after hours, especially if you're, again, I was a small church pastor, so it's not like I had a secretary, it's not like I had other people around. So when someone off the streets is coming to see me, they're seeing me when there's no one else in the building. So a lot of times when that happens, I usually would tell Laura, I'd say, hey, from this time to this time, I'm meeting with this person, and I'm meeting with a client, or I may say I'm meeting with this particular client, and I may say their name, and then I'm done. Our session is done at this time, and then I'll be home at this time. So then that way I'm kind of creating a timeline or a record. So in case if there's any false accusations, at least there was a timeline. At least there's a timeline of people saying, okay, here's what's going on. And sometimes, I'd make sure I have a window in my door. So sometimes if someone was coming in while I was having a session, they would see I was having a session. I just would wave at them, and I'd just say, oh, it's one of my elders walking through, cleaning, or the custodian's coming. And I'll just let them know who's coming here, and kind of let them know ahead of time. And so they knew that there was someone going to be in the space. So then and I think in that way, it kind of made them feel safe. And it means more for protection for me as well, in case if things turn. So it's protection for me and for the client as well, that there's going to be around. So if anything weird happened, there at least would be somebody who could give an account. As far as the topic, should pastors counsel? I mean, I'm kind of torn with that, because even now, I don't know if I would ever do counseling with parishioners in the church, or even do it in the community anymore, to be quite honest.
Why is that?
Well, for the main reason that I got my master's of divinity in 2000, and I got it in 2012. And again, like when you are a counselor, when you are a licensed counselor, you always have to go and get a continuing education credits. So you always have to go to keep your license.
It's like
active.
education. If you're a public school teacher, you have to continue on. Even if you have a master's degree, you have to continue on with, so many hours every year of continuing ed.
Now, I mean, I still get emails from like Psychology Today, and I still get like letters from the ACA, or even sometimes there's even like a Christian Counselor Association. I think it was like the CCAA. And, even though I kind of tried to keep up to date with some of the things that, are happening, I'm so far removed. I mean, when I went to school, it was the DSM-4. We have the DSM-5. So for me, I feel like if I was to counsel somebody, I may not necessarily know what was current, especially, or the changes that were made.
Yeah.
And that may not be bad, because, anxiety, an anxiety disorder is an anxiety disorder. There's not much that shifts with that between one DSM to another. But I know like things like they just added I know they had bulimia nervosa and anorexia nervosa, which are kind of a psychological thing for eating disorders. They added more now. There's a couple more things that added to the eating disorder. So there's something there. I think video game addiction at one time was going to be added to the DSM. I don't think it was.
I might have that.
Oh, geez. But
do you have that, Scott?
No, I don't. I don't. But I think one of the interesting things too is I think like with the LGBT community, DSM-2, that was a psychological disorder, and now I think it's been written out by the time. I know they had they called it a social factor in the DSM-4, if I remember right. But then you go to the DSM-5, I don't even think it's in the DSM-5. at all. And again, I haven't looked at the DSM-5, so I could be wrong with that. So, when you think about that, how much the different techniques and tools and how to really impact people to meet their emotional and psychological well-being, like for me, I have a hard time now being able to say, yeah, I can counsel you from a psychological perspective because I've been out of it for so long and I haven't been really keeping up to date or track or I guess my pseudo CE credits because I'm just doing it myself because again, I'm a pastoral counselor. I don't need to take CE credits because I don't have a license that needs to keep up to date. And so for me, I think over time, I may not be the best person to see. Like, I mean, if someone wants to see me and they want to talk to me about counseling stuff, yeah, I'll have them. But then after that thing, I might say, I may, I know somebody who's a very good counselor. There's a great Christian counseling organization here where they're all licensed counselors. I can refer you to them and just kind of not do it. Because I think in some ways it's going to help build the relationship better. So I'm not knowing all the intricate details of someone's why they're seeing me for counseling. And I think it kind of helps keep that pastor-parishioner relationship in a good way. So you're not trying to bounce the role between pastor and parishioner and counselor and client.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And it covers you, right? Like, it's
Well,
just,
and even that, like when I was doing counseling, I still had to get liability insurance for my counseling.
yeah.
So if I was going to counsel someone, I would have to get liability insurance because here's the thing. If I didn't have that and something was to go wrong and I did something wrong, or if I was accused of doing something wrong, who's taking the brunt of that lawsuit?
Yeah.
If I'm doing it in the church is going to be sued. So a lot of times I would always, and I know before when I mentioned counseling, there'd be some questions like, no, I pay for my own liability insurance. And again, I think I was only paying like $30 annually for a liability assurance of up to $3 million. So again, not bad. It's cheap, but I also don't want that to, and then going, of course, when you look at all the church's insurance, it's like, if something were to happen, my insurance would get hit first. And then if anything was over 3 million in damages, then the church's liability insurance would kick in too. And that's how it kind of works. So in that way, it's like, in a way I'm protecting the church by having a liability insurance if I'm counseling people. And even when I get a liability insurance, I have to put that I'm a non-licensed pastoral counseling because they do have that section. So they know I'm a pastoral counselor. So they know that, hey, this is a guy who is not licensed, who's doing counseling. So that's why my premium was $6 to $8. Or I think if you're a licensed counselor, it probably might have been $12 for 3 million, which is very cheap. But so that was kind of the and all that was through the ACA, the American Counseling Association, when I got that. But yeah, and I think the reason why is because even though I know myself and I'm not going to take advantage of someone who's coming in, but there's a lot of pastors who maybe took a counseling course in their seminary thing, or maybe they took a class on how to do pastoral counseling. And just by taking a semester, they think that they're counselors, trained counselors that can do great work. And that's not true. The other issue with pastors being counselors is it also depends on the organization or the seminary that you're part of, how they view counseling. Years ago, Liberty University had an ad that had the Bible. The Bible was on a table, and then the DSM was on top of it. I believe it is, or it was switched. But the message it was portraying is that counseling is about the Word of God first. That's the foundation, and the DSM is second. Where Ashland, what I've learned at Ashland was the Bible and the DSM are together. Like they are partners in counseling. It's not, this is one, this is the supplement. They're both equally important when you are counseling someone, both the scriptures and the DSM. And we have to treat both of them with respect. Not one's better than the other. They're both equally important. So just that mentality of how a organization, whether that would be the SOT at Anderson University or Liberty University or Ashland or whatever seminary, how they approach their counseling is also going to shape how pastors do counseling within their offices with either parishioners or with outside people.
Yeah, I mean, I would tell you firsthand that in my seminary experience that I took pastoral care, pastoral counseling, ethics 1 and 2. But I don't, like you said, Scott, like I can offer advice and offer names of folks that I know that do counseling professionally, but I don't think that I would put myself in the place and feel good about it counseling somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing about counseling is solely relationship based. And one of the first things when I took counseling ethics, one of the very first things, and I remember it was Dr. Weatherby. Every class session, I would go in and take that class every Thursday. The first thing he would say as he's teaching ethics, do not sleep with your client. Now, as funny as that is, we would go through ethics and we talk about things, but one of the things he said is, and he actually had a speaker come in, at least not during my class, but years prior, he had a speaker come in who was a student of this particular cohort, and the student shared their story about how they're in this program. And they remember hearing Dr. Weatherby always say, don't sleep with your client, don't sleep with your client. And always figured, well, that's not going to happen to me. I'm a Christian. I go to church. I'm happily married. It's not going to happen to me. And then it did. And they lost their licensing credentials. And they're not allowed to do counseling anymore. And it tore their family apart. And the thing is they say that, since it's so highly relational, that even when you are dealing with other stressors, whether they're outside of the counseling room or dealing with all the stressors of all the people who are coming to you with all their problems, it's very, and they call it transference and countertransference, where easily you can start to identify with somebody, a client, and they can share their story or share the things and go, man, that just feels like where I'm at right now. I can relate to exactly. And that may be good fuel to kind of really help your client get through some stuff. Cause like, hey, I'm in that same season of life with you. We can work together. We can get through this and do this and be a very beneficial, and it can work. But at the same time, you start to see those things that you may be struggling with, or the same season of life that you're in, can be the glue that bonds you to kind of take your client counseling relationship to a new level of unhealthiness in relationships. Even in the ACA, they say that you are not allowed to even date a client, period. So even if you were no longer seeing that client anymore, you were not allowed to date them. Now they kind of changed the rules where you can start dating a client, but it has to be 15 years after you terminated services.
Interesting.
So if I'm counseling a woman, and let's say I'm single, and I'm counseling a woman, and let's say we have an attraction to each other, I'm not allowed to even go on a date or contact her or anything else for 15 years. Before, and if 15 years, if I still am attracted to this woman, she's still attracted to me, then I can date her. And I think the main reason why that is because of the relationship between the counselor and the client is so ingrained, it's so relational driven. They want to make sure that the person that you apparently are are in love with, apparently, in the counseling room, that is just not because of the counseling culture, that it's actually something outside. So it's almost like we're going to get ourselves so far removed from the counseling thing that even afterwards, we're still like, yeah, I still like you. You still like me. Cool. We can date now. It's been 15 years since we've terminated services. So that's something that I think is very interesting. But the same thing is when you add that to the church, churches are very relational driven. So if you are a pastor and a parishioner and a counselor and a client, your relationship takes on many, many different layers. And it can be very easy to fall into those traps where now this relationship is starting to become a love affair. And that, and then you might make comments like the example that our listener gave, like, oh, the pastor said, hey, if I wasn't married, I'd date you. Like that's messed up. Like that's, I mean, couldn't even imagine a pastor saying that to somebody. And I could have imagined myself as a counselor saying that to someone. Like that is egregious. That is egregious. Like if I said that, I wouldn't go say, oh, don't tell anybody. If I said that, I would want someone to report me that I made a comment like that, because that shows that there is something really wrong, or if it's not only wrong, but apparently I have crossed the boundary of what is acceptable by not only a pastor, but also as a counselor as well in that setting.
I mean, there's just so many different ways that you could approach it, right? And I remember when I was in seminary, I did, um, like I said, some ethics courses, pastoral care and counseling. Um, but as a part of my capstone in seminary, I had to write kind of like a manual, if you will, of like things not to do. And I think you described it a little bit earlier about like the whole idea of making sure that your door is cracked, making sure there's windows, making sure that like your spouse knows where you are and when you're going to come home, like making sure that there's somebody else in the building and you're not alone, and making sure, and I know that's not always possible with smaller churches, but like in your case, Scott, you said you texted Laura and you were like, this is what I'm doing, this is where I'm at, this is who I'm meeting with, this is the time I'm meeting, this is the time I'm going to be home. These are all the situations where you're covering yourself. And
Yeah.
I put those things together so that like um I create, like I said, I created a manual that, would basically just cover my rear end if I were ever in that situation.
Yeah. And well,
Um
I mean, the one thing I would kind of argue against is, I know you said like, well, not small churches can do that. Well, small churches can.
no,
I
no, no,
mean,
I'm
even
just
if
saying.
I'm saying that even if you weren't married, I had the luxury. I was already married. I could tell Laura where I was. But if I wasn't married, I could tell my head elder. I could tell somebody who I trust in the church, saying, "Hey, I'm counseling this person. I'm counseling a woman, and I don't even have to say names. Like I am counseling a woman from 4 to 5. My session starts at 4. At 5, I'm going to call you again to let you know when my session is done and I'm on my way home." You
I
can still
was
do accountability. Yeah.
No, I know I'm not disagreeing with that, Scott. Don't
Yeah.
what I was saying that like smaller churches don't always have the luxury of having somebody else in the building
Oh, okay.
when
Then I
when
misunderstood. I'm sorry.
yeah. Like I'm just saying because you had mentioned earlier, like you did counseling in a smaller church, and it's like you don't always have the luxury of having somebody else around when you're counseling somebody. Like I know that when I worked in a larger church, that when pastor was counseling somebody, like there's always other staff around. There's always somebody in the building. So if something were to go down, somebody's going to be there. So that's all I meant by that.
Yeah. And I think, and again, like I'll go back to what our listeners said, that, they wish that there are more organizations like church, like, your national church organizations, that they would, you know, be partnered with someone like Grace, which is a godly response to abuse in the church environment. And I mean, I looked at their annual report from last year, And it's interesting because in the last year, only 150 churches actually used them to kind of assess their culture to see if they had stuff that was, you know, that their environment or their churches were safe places that, you know, that A, abuse wouldn't happen here, and B, if it did, they have a system on how to report abuse. So it was very, very good. And I mean, that's the thing that I think is kind of good in some ways, because, you know, when something like this happens, and if you're a church where you notice that, hey, we had this incident happen, you know, you're not alone. And even if your national office may not have something out there, there's a lot of independent places. And I would even recommend, and my recommendation is this, is even if you're part of a big national denomination like a Baptist or a Methodist, if something happened where there was abuse, or someone or a pastor was counseling somebody and they kind of took that relationship a little bit outside of the healthy boundaries that it needs to be, I'd say, you know, I know the UMC probably has a group of people or has an organization within the UMC that can go and do assessments of this sort of thing. But my response, my personal opinion is, I would always get like an independent company to come in and assess, mainly because, especially with the SBC, we have seen how so many times people have sent stuff to the SBC and it was either swept under the rug, or the response is, okay, we're going to move this pastor out of this church because obviously, clearly they're calling us in damage, but then they put them in a different church. So they kind of blanket over the situation, but they don't fix the problem that you have a predator in the pulpit who's not, and you're just moving a predator to a different culture so that they could do the same thing again.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you're interested, that website that our listener sent us was netgrace.org, netgrace.org. You can check it out. They have a wonderful bunch of services. And again, if you're a pastor, and let's say if you're a pastor and you are a counselor as well, you know, I would highly consider maybe not doing counseling. Or maybe if you do an assessment, and then always send them off to somebody else. Because I feel like when you are a pastor, you're dealing with too many relationships, and not just like loving relationships, because the church, you can have a lot of loving relationships, but you can also have a lot of strained relationships. And sometimes just dealing with people, and maybe if you're dealing with difficult people and it just kind of lowers your guard and you feel strained, and then you have that one session with that one client where you really get along with, and it kind of gives you like that serotonin boost of excitement, and you are all energetic again, and you're excited because you had a good session with this client. You know, that's another perfect breeding ground for misconduct to happen. Because if you feel drained and then you go and you talk to someone who excites you, you're going to start having feelings and start having a different connection, a different view of that person than just a parishioner. You're going to see them a little bit more, and it can cause damage. So, so just be aware of that. And, you know, and that's just my opinion, you know, as someone who has done counseling in the past as a pastor, I'm very much on the side of just referring people. I'm fine with meeting them. I'm fine with talking with them. I'm fine with praying with them. I'm fine with meeting them to talk about spiritual things. But when we start talking about psychological stuff, I'm going to refer you, just because I feel like that's going to, it's not that I don't love you, but I love you too much that I want to refer you to someone who is very skilled and someone who's up to date with all the different knowledge of the psychological world, that they can do the best thing to make you whole that I would not be able to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Anything else you want to add, Micah?
No, I think we covered it.
I think we covered it too. And again, thank you so much to our listener who sent that to us. Very great topic, and hopefully this has helped you with your kind of healing process. just knowing that there are other people who are on your side, and other people who may be going through the same thing. And if you're somebody who, you went through an experience where you're seeking counseling at a church and things got awkward or things went really bad, feel free to message us. We can definitely share your story anonymously on our website, just to know. And especially, check out websites like netgrace.org, these independent groups that can go into your churches to assess them, to say, hey, this is a very good church that we believe that nothing's ever 100% sure, but we believe that there is a high rate of no abuse being able to happen, or if abuse does happen, that this culture will respond in the appropriate ways, versus saying, oh, okay, you need to make some changes. You need to add some doors with windows. You need to make sure that there's stuff here that needs to happen, or this church is not suitable to do counseling, or the pastor's not suitable to do counseling, so don't offer it, period. So friends, thank you so much for listening. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll be back on next week with another episode. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman Podcast. The Scott Stedman Podcast is made possible by support from our listeners. We thank listeners like Patty and Scott, whose support goes to this podcast's continual growth and maintenance. If you want to support this podcast, you can do so in a number of ways. First, feel free to give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends. If you'd like to financially support the Scott Stedman Podcast, you can go to the website ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. That website again is ko-fi.com/the Scott Stedman Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.